Welcome back, everyone. This video will explore the wealth of evidence suggesting that the combination of carbon dioxide starvation and plate tectonics caused the greatest extinctions on Earth, collectively known as the end-Permian extinction, or the Great Dying. The end-Permian marked the transition from 300 million years of Paleozoic plant and animal dominance and the resetting of Earth's evolutionary trajectory towards our modern-day fauna. The Permian extinctions represented a loss of 57% of all biological families, 83% of all genera, 81% of marine species, and 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species that were in existence at the end Permian's last million years. Coinciding with these Permian extinctions was the decline of abundant carbon dioxide concentrations since the Ordovician period to the stressful low concentrations in the Permian. For the first time in Earth's history, carbon dioxide concentrations fell below 1,000 parts per million, the concentration that supports maximum photosynthesis productivity. While plants suffered from low carbon dioxide, land vertebrate extinctions were largely the result of oxygen's dramatic roller coaster ride that crashed in the Permian. It is essential to first understand how changes in carbon dioxide concentrations affect photosynthesis and plant productivity. The key productivity enzyme, RUBISCO, grabs a carbon dioxide molecule and then shuttles it down a metabolic pathway to produce the sugars and carbohydrates essential for all life. Today, various versions of RUBISCO are saturated when carbon dioxide reaches 1,000 parts per million, thus maximizing photosynthetic production. During the Ordovician, with CO2 concentrations 5 times greater than the saturation level, newly evolving photosynthesizing species were not limited by competition for carbon dioxide. Thus, the greatest phytoplankton diversity developed then. By the Permian, carbon dioxide concentrations fell to a stressfully low 200 parts per million, and very few new species appeared. Our current atmospheric concentrations are only 40% of the optimum. For that reason, modern commercial greenhouses raise CO2 to 1,000 parts per million for maximum crop yields. During the pre-industrial times of the Little Ice Age, CO2 concentrations fell to 280 parts per million, and evidence shows during that time ocean productivity was far lower than today. If CO2 concentrations fall below 150 parts per million, then photosynthesis can stop completely. So policies to sequester and lower CO2 must be very careful not to approach this deadly level. There are many competing theories regarding the causes of the massive Permian extinctions, but scientists are nowhere near a consensus. Clickbait media, such as the New York Times, has been obsessed only with theories blaming warming temperatures. They then segue those theories into fearful narratives about extinction threats from modern global warming. However, many researchers have pointed to the competition for the declining carbon dioxide. That resulted in severely reduced photosynthesis, the collapse of primary productivity, and a significant malfunction of the global food webs. Evidence is rapidly accumulating to support their conclusions. There is a strong correlation with the origination of new Paleozoic phytoplankton species, illustrated in green, and the concentration of carbon dioxide seen on the right. During the Great Ordovician biodiversification event, the greatest abundance of newly evolved phytoplankton species correlated with high CO2 concentrations. New species typically also suffer higher extinction rates, illustrated in red, as they evolve to survive in niches that are still in flux. As CO2 concentrations plummeted during the Devonian, when land plants competed for and sequestered more carbon dioxide, fewer new marine phytoplankton species evolved, and extinctions increased. By the end Carboniferous and early Permian periods, virtually no new species appeared as carbon dioxide concentrations fell dangerously close to levels at which photosynthesis could no longer be supported. As a result, much of the green algae clades that had dominated the Paleozoic oceans had died off, although this clade also provided the ancestors for land plants. Phytoplankton from the red clades, with more efficient photosynthesis, rose to dominance later in the age of dinosaurs and still dominate ocean primary productivity today. When CO2 concentrations reached their lowest levels ever in the early Permian, phytoplankton fossils became extremely rare, and the Permian experienced what scientists call a phytoplankton blackout. So why the Permian blackout? Well, biased by the last mass extinction event at the end of the Cretaceous, when the Earth was struck by an asteroid, researchers often search for a single devastating event, like an asteroid or a massive volcanic eruption, to explain what happened during that end Permian. However, there is a growing scientific belief that the Permian extinctions were more gradual and caused by a protracted decline in environmental conditions that slowly reduced the Earth's biodiversity and thus reduced the probability of new species evolving that can adapt to changing conditions. This notion of a protracted extinction was discussed in the 2021 paper, Dead Clades Walking. A clade is a group of organisms that evolved from a common ancestor. Multiple minor extinction events can gradually reduce a clade's biodiversity and its resilience so that the clade is doomed to extinction several million years later. Clearly, a mass extinction does not require an asteroid. The gradual reduction in phytoplankton and photosynthesis can collapse food webs and result in major extinctions that, in the sparse fossil record, are incorrectly interpreted as a relatively rapid extinction event. The media likes to emphasize the Earth's 5 great mass extinctions, but several previous minor extinctions have all contributed to dead clades walking, clades that finally went extinct during the Permian mass extinction. The first so-called great mass extinction happened during the Ordovician, just after the Great Biodiversity event. Associated with the Ordovician ice house, 61% of marine life disappeared and mostly culled many of the new species that had recently evolved in a previous warmer climate. The late Devonian mass extinction was more disruptive, involving the loss of entire carbonate reef ecosystems that had dominated the early Paleozoic oceans. However, many researchers now believe that the end Devonian extinctions were simply the last of up to 7 protracted minor extinction events during a time when the colonizing of the continents by land plants was rapidly depleting carbon dioxide concentrations and dramatically reducing phytoplankton biodiversity. The beginning of another glacial period during the mid-Carboniferous caused 14 to 39% of the marine genera to go extinct. The Carboniferous Rainforest Collapse, driven by drying continents and extremely low carbon dioxide concentrations, is considered to be only a minor extinction event, yet it totally altered tropical ecosystems and marked the peak in atmospheric oxygen before oxygen plummeted during the Permian. Between 7 and 17 million years before the end Permian mass extinction, between 35 and 47% of marine invertebrate genera went extinct, as well as nearly 80% of land vertebrates. Those previous extinction events reduce biodiversity and support beliefs that the end Permian mass extinction event was likely the culmination of dead Clades walking. The end Triassic and the end Cretaceous mass extinctions are the last two of the great extinctions, but will not be examined here. By sequestering carbon dioxide and raising oxygen concentrations, photosynthesis paved the way for its own demise by amplifying photorespiration, which greatly reduces photosynthesis in both marine and land plants. The key enzyme, RUBISCO, first evolved when CO2 was abundant and oxygen was scarce. Thus, under those conditions, RUBISCO could be sloppy about discriminating between carbon dioxide and oxygen, yet still be productive. As oxygen concentrations increase and CO2 decrease throughout the Paleozoic, RUBISCO increasingly grabbed oxygen instead of carbon dioxide, initiating destructive photorespiration that reduces plant productivity. Laboratory experiments under current oxygen levels found when carbon dioxide concentrations are as low as 220 parts per million, plant biomass production is reduced by 50%. And 30% of that reduced productivity was due to photorespiration. When carbon dioxide was reduced to 150 parts per million, productivity was reduced by 92%. For ocean phytoplankton, reduced carbon dioxide is even more detrimental. When carbon dioxide diffuses into the ocean, most molecules immediately react with water, creating three forms of inorganic carbon: carbon dioxide, bicarbonate, and carbonate ions. The left graph. Bicarbonate ions now constitute over 90% of the ocean's inorganic carbon, but RUBISCO can only use carbon dioxide molecules. Furthermore, as carbon dioxide is depleted, ocean pH rises, seen in the right graph. And ocean pH controls how the inorganic carbon is proportioned between more usable carbon dioxide and bicarbonate ions. When CO2 falls to 200 parts per million, ocean pH rises to 8.5, and the amount of available carbon dioxide approaches zero. To survive the negative effects of reduced carbon dioxide, phytoplankton have evolved carbon dioxide concentrating mechanisms that increase the internal carbon dioxide concentration. Photosynthesizing cyanobacteria evolved the ability to import bicarbonate ions and shuttle them into a carboxysome where an enzyme converts bicarbonate ions into carbon dioxide while in the proximity of RUBISCO. Algae also evolved similar mechanisms with pyrenoids. Without a carbon concentrating mechanism, Paleozoic phytoplankton species experience very limited growth. All modern phytoplankton have developed various carbon dioxide concentrating mechanisms to survive in today's low carbon dioxide world. Experimental phytoplankton strains with dysfunctional carbon dioxide concentrating mechanisms just do not survive. As carbon dioxide has declined over the last 20 million years, several clades of land plants, yet still a small percentage of all species, have evolved a similar carbon dioxide concentrating mechanism known as C4 photosynthesis. In the upper sunlit euphotic zone, phytoplankton generate an abundance of dissolved organic matter and sinking particulate matter. That organic matter sustains an abundance of marine life in the complex food webs of the dark twilight zone. Today's oceans contain as much dissolved organic matter as exists in the Earth's terrestrial ecosystems. Several scientists had questioned the reliability of the phytoplankton blackout data because robust invertebrate communities persisted in the fossil record for longer times despite crashes in phytoplankton species. However, awareness of the bacterial loop, first published in 1983, has altered scientific thinking about the ocean food webs. Before 1983, it was widely believed that only phytoplankton could directly sustain the zooplankton and benthic animals. However, it is now understood that the bacterial loop recycles dissolved organic matter and thus can maintain a substantial food web until the dissolved organic matter is depleted. However, unlike oxygen-generating phytoplankton, the bacterial loop consumes oxygen and expands the oxygen minimum zones, which coincide with the many deadly anoxic events of the Permian. The complex interactions between disappearing phytoplankton, cyanobacteria, and bacterial loops resulted in the extinction of various Permian marine animals in various niches, but at different times. Looking more closely at the stages of the Permian, beginning with the ending of the Paleozoic Ice Age, there were large losses in biodiversity with major extinctions during the earliest Permian stages. Ammonoids had been declining for the Permian's first 30 million years, with many going extinct 17 million years before the end Permian extinction. By the Capetanian stage, 75% of the Permian coral families became extinct, as well as 82% of coral species. By the end Capetanian stage, 7 to 10 million years before the end Permian, 35 to 47% of all marine invertebrate genera had gone extinct. Many researchers now include the Capetanian extinctions as one of the Earth's 6 great mass extinctions, and separated from the end Permian. The Capetanian extinctions happened in a cool climate and before the rapid rise in CO2 and the warming that some blame for causing the end Permian extinctions. On land, North American coal deposits disappeared in the early Permian after the Carboniferous Rainforest collapsed. Stressful atmospheric CO2 hovered between 150 and 700 parts per million during the late Carboniferous. The lowest calculated values of 100 parts per million would have been lethal for many permanent Permian plant species and correlates with the disappearance of the coal deposits. Both laboratory experiments and paleontological evidence show most plant species respond to low carbon dioxide concentrations by producing more stomata to increase CO2 diffusion into the plant. However, more stomata increased water loss and made the Permian plants more vulnerable to the increasing dryness throughout Pangaea's formation. As a result, minor plant extinctions happened throughout the Permian, starting with the Carboniferous tropical rainforest collapse. The towering lycopsid rainforest trees went extinct, leaving only related diminutive species requiring less carbon, some of which have survived until today and are frequently used in terrariums. As moisture-requiring species were extirpated and drought-tolerant species increased, food chains were gravely disrupted, resulting in the mid-Permian Olsen extinctions. By the Rhodian stage, 45% of the plant species had gone extinct in the Chinese microcontinents, and by the Capetanian, 56% had gone extinct. Declining biodiversity reduces the probability of the new species evolving that would otherwise balance out natural background extinctions. The formation of Pangaea had a negative effect on biodiversity. Pangaea removed unique niches from its converging island-like microcontinents. Studies of modern island biology have demonstrated how only a few species are genetically capable of producing a radiation of new species, and only when vacant niches are available. For example, the oldest existing volcanic Hawaiian island, Kauai, emerged about 5 million years ago from the ocean, which is about the time of the arrival of the ancestor of Hawaii's honey creepers. Since then, one ancestor gave rise to at least 12 unique species, each evolving varied beaks to exploit Hawaii's unique vegetation. Of the hundreds of continental vagrant species that ever arrived on the Hawaiian Islands, only a few remained, and they only evolved small changes in size or color. But even fewer that remain possess the flexible genomes that allow successful speciation that could exploit unfamiliar but available niches. Likewise, the ancestors of the Galapagos finches arrived about 2 million years ago on the volcanic islands and radiated into at least 14 unique species. During the early Paleozoic, in the Ordovician, many of today's continental landmasses were just a multitude of separate large volcanic islands or microcontinents. Islands provided more coastlines with unique coastal niches for marine species. There were also more abundant shallow seas that readily recycled critical nutrients that would otherwise be sequestered in the deeper ocean. The convergence of those Ordovician microcontinents into the fully united single continent of Pangaea during the Permian reduced coastlines and the aerial extent of shallow seas. Pangaea's formation also provided connectivity that allowed more competitive generalist species to invade and eradicate species living in previously unique niches of isolated islands. The loss of productive shallow seas exterminated the least productive species within those habitats, and the loss of coastlines reduced the flow of water vapor from the ocean to the inland. As Pangaea consolidated, the continental interiors dried, and inland species that had adapted to previous wetter climates became the first to go extinct, like the lycopsid trees of the Carboniferous Rainforest. However, species on the islands of North and South China persisted for millions of years later. The drivers and timing of terrestrial vertebrate extinctions often differed from ocean extinctions. However, the ultimate drivers were still carbon dioxide starvation and Pangaea's formation. As plants colonized the land, global carbon dioxide was further reduced to near lethal levels for the algae by the end of the Carboniferous, while oxygen levels rapidly increased to the highest levels ever in the Earth's history, benefiting greater animal speciation. The abundance of oxygen enabled an increase in terrestrial biodiversity, as the more aquatic species could venture further onto the land and survive, as sufficient oxygen simply diffused through their moist skin or via other forms of primitive breathing. The legacy of these early evolutionary experiments are still seen in amphibian and reptile species that survive today. Lungless salamanders are still totally reliant on simple diffusion through their skin for the uptake of oxygen, the orange bars, and removal of carbon dioxide, the green bars. Many frogs and salamanders have aquatic larvae that breathe in the water with gills, then metamorphose to air-breathing adults with moist skin and primitive lungs ventilated by constant throat flutters. Despite better evolved breathing mechanisms, many reptiles still supplement their oxygen via diffusion through their skin. However, oxygen concentrations plummeted during the Permian as the phytoplankton blackout, the rainforest collapse, and Pangaea switched to less productive vegetation in drier conditions dramatically reduced the photosynthetic production of oxygen. Different clades of land vertebrates that had recently evolved in a climate of abundant oxygen could not compete with species that had evolved more efficient breathing. Insects also rely on passive diffusion for breathing. The high oxygen concentrations enabled the evolution of the Earth's biggest insects and centipedes during the Carboniferous. However, those giant insects were the first to go extinct as oxygen levels plummeted during the Permian. In fact, it was the only time our Earth had ever experienced the mass extinction of insect clades. Because true amphibians and reptiles had not evolved yet, and the varied characteristics of Permian vertebrates often blurred the line between reptile and amphibian, many Permian vertebrates are best referred to as just tetrapods, the four-leggeds, or amniotes if they no longer need to lay their eggs in water. One clade of amphibian-like animals, the Lespospondyls, appeared in the Carboniferous but were extinct by the mid-Permian. Another clade of amphibian-like tetrapods also evolved in the Carboniferous, and some evolved reptile-like characteristics as well. While some species also went extinct by the mid-Permian, others survived into the age of dinosaurs. Synapsids were reptile-like animals whose surviving species gave rise to mammals. The pelycosaurs were synapsids that dominated the early Permian, but went extinct by the mid-Permian. The dinocephalians were synapsids that replaced the pelycosaurs, but they went extinct by the Permian's Encapitanian stage. Diapsid clades replaced the synapsids in the mid-Permian. This clade's more versatile genetics withstood the end-Permian extinctions and enabled the Mesozoic evolution of crocodiles, dinosaurs, birds, snakes, and lizards, many of which have persisted through today. In light of all the many extinction factors, the New York Times promotion of only climate warming as the cause of Permian mass extinctions, simply to maintain fear regards our current climate warming, is egregiously irresponsible. The serial reduction of biodiversity for most clades from the Ordovician to the end Permian strongly suggests carbon dioxide starvation was a far more powerful ecosystem disruptor than periodic warming episodes. The loss of 61% of marine biodiversity during the Ordovician glaciations not only demonstrates the lethal power of colder temperatures, but also calls into question the role of carbon dioxide as a temperature control knob. The Ordovician icehouse happened when CO2 concentrations were 10 times higher than today at 5,000 parts per million. Some scientists argue solar output was 4% lower and thus counteracted any warming from high carbon dioxide. But a solar drop of 7 watts per meter squared of insolation does not counteract 13.5 watts per meter squared of calculated greenhouse warming. The late Paleozoic icehouse has been attributed to falling carbon dioxide concentrations, even though the glaciations were initiated in the early Carboniferous when carbon dioxide was about 2,000 parts per million. Scientists have proposed other theories for glaciations happening under high carbon dioxide concentrations, suggesting the formation of Pangaea prevented warm ocean currents from moderating the polar climate of the southern hemisphere. By cherry-picking the rise in carbon dioxide only during the very end Permian, such blinkered analyses has allowed some researchers to echo the narrative that it was deadly carbon dioxide-driven global warming that caused end Permian extinctions. And then they fearmonger their conclusions to rant we're in danger of extinction from today's 1 degree Celsius of climate warming. However, such theories totally fail to account for dead Clades Walking and the numerous extinctions that set the stage for the end Permian extinctions via colder conditions and carbon dioxide starvation. So I encourage you to heed the warning from Aesop 2,500 years ago. We must avoid any remedy that is worse than the disease. Rash attempts to sequester carbon dioxide and lower its concentrations to levels approaching plant starvation will prove to be disastrous. Likewise, shun Bill Gates' block the sun proposal. Such lunacy will definitely disrupt the Earth's life-giving carbon cycle and upset global productivity and devastate all ecosystems. Scientists must take a closer look at how carbon dioxide starvation caused the world's greatest extinction and act accordingly. Furthermore, clickbait media needs to be shamed into honestly educating the public about all the science. Thank you. For more superb educational climate science, please bookmark my YouTube channel or read the transcripts at perhapsallnatural.blogspot.com. Thank you.